So really appreciate it. Thank you very much, everybody, to come to our webinar. I think this is 9th of Ocean Nexus Ocean Equity webinar. And today I'm just really delighted that I have Dr. Lorén Spears with me. And to be quite honest, the way I met Lorén was, so my colleague, Dr. Amelie Moore, introduced me to Lorén, saying like, Yosh, now you're in Rhode Island and you don't know anyone. So I'm going to introduce one of my best fellow and colleagues and a friend, Dr. Lorén Spears. You should go and meet her. So I was supposed to meet Lorén. We made many changes for our Zoom meeting, and stupid of me missed the Zoom meeting. I felt really bad. So I asked my partner to come with me to visit Lorén's museum at the Tomaquag, where it was a little chocolate or something, and went there. Lorén wasn't there, but stuff and everybody was there. So I said like, I'm so sorry, you know, I just skipped it. Well, I missed that meeting and all this. And you know, afterwards, the Lorén country contacted me and they said like, let's meet in the cafe. And then we met in the cafe maybe about like a month ago, bit less, and we just talked, and I learned just so much. And it was really interesting because Lorén said, like, Yosh, what can I do for you? And I was, well, I mean, you can do many things, but I'm supposed to be here to ask, you know, what can we do to work with you? But, you know, Lorén just kindly offered. So I took offer and asked her to be on this webinar. And after the setting up the webinar, everything, Karina Oscar did all the great work to make a program. Then I got so excited. I started reading a blog of Tomaquag Museum, and I got so excited. I started asking Lorén, can you talk about this? Can you talk about that? You know, and Lorén goes like, Yosh, you know, that's not what I was set in. You told me different things. So I have to tell Lorén, I just got so excited. It is typical of me. I'm so sorry. So anyhow, but I'm going to ask a question about those things. So if you have a chance, you should go and read blog of Tomaquag Museum. It's absolutely full of information, really wonderful. Anyway, so I should introduce Lorén first. Dr. Lorén Spears enrolled Narragansett Tribal Nation citizen and executive director of Tomaquag Museum. She holds a master's in education and received a doctor of humane letters honoris causa in 2017 from University of Rhode Island, and a Doctor of Education honoris causa from Roger Williams University in 2021. Obviously, she's an author, artist, share her cultural knowledge with the public through museum programs, and do many, many things, including, you know, helping new friends and be on the webinar. So I'm just so delighted, Lorén, to have you here. Thank you very much. And I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you, Yoshi. I appreciate it. I did just pop the blog link into the chat so people could have it. Ascui Kwasin, Natasuis Makasini Pashao at Narragansett, Natasuis Lorén Spears at Englisha, Nin Narragansett Niantic, Kanupiam at Aki at Narragansett. So hello, everyone. As you know, I'm Lorén Spears. My traditional name is Makasini Pashao. I am an enrolled citizen of the Narragansett Nation, but I am also descend from the Niantic peoples. And I welcomed you virtually here to the homelands of the Narragansett Nation. And so I'm delighted to be here, and Yoshi and I did turn into best friends over tea. So, my nature is very chatty, so that's a good thing. But let me go ahead and share my screen, and so that we can make sure there's time to chat at the end as well, because I wanted to share my presentation just to give us a little grounding in this space. So the name of my presentation is Kíttan, which translates as ocean, but in English, but we think of it as sacred waters. So honoring the gifts of Kíttan. And So when you think of who we are as Narragansett people, we are the people of this place. The people of the small points is the actual literal translation of the word Narragansett, which in English is said as Narragansett. We've been in this place. Scientists argue, but the latest numbers I've heard are 30,000 years, but whether it's 20,000 or 30,000, we've been here for a long time compared to 400 years of Europeans being on this place. So there's a phrase that has been a quote that our community elders use sometimes, which is time out of mind, meaning it's so long ago, it's out of our mind. Other people use the words like time immemorial. But the idea that we are in this place, we are connected to this place, our identities are connected to this place. We are Eastern Woodland coastal people, and our relationship with the land and the waters and all of the elements of this earth are in this place. Nukasaki is Mother Earth, and of course it's made up of the land and the waters and all the plants and animals. And if we want to separate ourselves from animals, the people, but all of our cycles of life are here. Our creation story is here. As I said, we were made from where the land and the water meets, literally out of the clay. That's where our creation story comes from, of how we were created to be on this place. The creator, Katantuit, he provided all what we need. We live in a very diverse ecosystem that gives us a lot of different resources. And so in this modern world, you hear people call this place Nukasaki Turtle Island, and because it's the story of the turtle holding up the land in order for Sky Daughter to land and populate the earth. And so all of these things become part of our lifeways, and our lifeways are connected to the lands and waters. And of course, these gifts need to be protected for future generations. So I'm going to give you just a little background of our, like a little cultural knowledge, thinking about our space and our relationship to Kíttan, the ocean. Our people had summer homes, despite the fact that today we're really dispossessed from being along the waterways. Our ancestors had summer and winter homes, went inland to the arbor of the forest for protection and closeness to the fresh waters and the game for feeding themselves. And in the summer, we moved to the summer villages, using the river systems to travel to and from the river systems, like where I am at Tomaquag Museum in Exeter. You can literally go down the Wood River to the Pawcatuck River out to Mesquamaket, or Napatree Point is called that today. And that's where the waters connect. And so our summer homes were next to these places where the resources were during the summer months, and allowing us to fish and collect and live where it was beautiful. And as we all know, in the summer, people go to the coast because it's cooler. In that picture, there's a picture of Princess Redwing, who was the co-founder of Tomaquag Museum in 1958. And that's at the original Tomaquag site, where they're putting summer mats from the cattails on the homes. And today, through the work that we do in our artist in residence programs and our cultural continuation programs in the museum, we're having, cattail mats created that can be seen by others today. Of course, there's the salt ponds. I have the quahogs at the top because that's something that's very common today. And of course, in English, we use a Narragansett word. It's a little bit abbreviated, but the quahog are the hard-shell clam. And we have also the soft-shell clams and oysters and blue-shell crabs and the periwinkles and the razor clams and the horseshoe crabs, all of these things that are in the salt ponds. And one of the things that I like to think about when we're in the salt ponds is the harvest and care and maintenance of the ponds that our ancestors were very astute at. And even into the 20th century, we hear stories of our elders and how they would navigate the salt ponds to ensure that the next generation of shellfish would be available for the next season or the next few seasons, and the way that they cycled those things around. That's a problematic today because there's so much restrictions on the salt ponds because of the commodification of the waters. And so, but it's still important in our families and communities. My grandson, as I mentioned to Yoshi, I have a 7-year-old, he just turned 7, grandson, and he was less than 2 years old and he was out in the salt ponds, out deep, actually. We sometimes floated him with the basket that held the clams. It's part of continuation of traditional knowledge. And so, of course, the gifts of Kíttan, ocean, include all the fish, the sturgeon, the herring, the bluefish, the salmon, you name it. I put a sturgeon there because lots of people, I'm talking to a lot of scientists, so they see it, but a lot of other people don't know what a sturgeon looks like. And of course, there's the hunting of whales and seals, the mammals from the ocean. And of course, even though I didn't put it here, it's also the plant life, the seaweed and other plants from the ocean. I mentioned some plants in the last slide. The salt marshes, the different birds, the cranes and ducks and geese and turtles and eels and fish and the different reeds and grasses. One of the things that always struck me as odd, whenever I've done traditional ecological knowledge, is what we call it, TEK, walks or talks or kayaks or things along the waterways, or just go there with my family, it always shocks me that people don't eat the rose hips. I'm not saying nobody, but there's lots of people that are shocked that we're eating them and come up to us and ask us questions about it and things like that. And so it's understanding and having a relationship with the plants and animals and resources that are in our ecosystem that are really important. And you see the snapping turtle bag, which was a gift to me, I think, on my 30th birthday, from Kinup Musitash. And it's that idea of that relationship that if you're going to eat the meat of the snapping turtle, then you're going to utilize all its gifts to honor the animal and its giving of its life for your life. And that is true for the plants and all the gifts of Nukasaki. So the gardening, of course, we have traditional gardening, corn, bean, squash, the three sisters, gourds, sunchoke, melons, the myriad of other things that we plant, tobacco for sacred and things of that nature. So there's all of these things that are going on, and they're connected to cycles of the seasons and the cycles of the moon and this interrelationship of waters. And then reminding ourselves that not only do you eat the gift of the corn, which is grown in our summer village, and it's directly connected to the ocean because you would put shell in the soil, you'd put fish in the soil, you'd put seaweed in the soil, those things to enrich the soil. And three sisters have that symbiotic relationship, but so with each other, but also the symbiotic relationship between fresh water, salt water, plants, animals, humans, all working together to create this symbiotic relationship that is necessary to grow those crops. And then give thanks for the gifts, whether that's making a corn husk doll for your child or grandchild, or making that beautiful corn husk mat at the bottom of the page for something useful in your home. And so there's all of those gifts that are going on that are in relationship with Kíttan, the ocean. So of course we continue to harvest throughout the season, seasons, plural. And so there's a myriad of things from land that are also along the waterways. Whether you're down in Charlestown at, what's the name of that park? Powauget Park. I have to say it correctly or my mother will chastise me. But at Powauget Park, it's right along the salt waters, and all along the edge there are cranberries that you can harvest. Sometimes you find them inland along the freshwater ponds and lakes, but you also can find them along the salt waters. And so there's all these things that are happening that are, bettering our ecosystem and our lifeways and foodways. Just some quick tool images, because of course, in your summer village, you would also have your tools for the gardening, but your tools for your architecture for making your home, but for fishing and hunting as well, making nets and hooks and knives and scrapers. We have some amazing artists today that make knives and scrapers and nets. Matter of fact, we had a net making class maybe a month or so ago, where the community was learning how to make nets from artists. This is a fishing weir. This particular weir is in our museum collection, but it's a river, so it would have to be estuarine or a brackish river or a brook you would use this in. But if you notice, it's like a basket. The fish side, it's for the fish that spawn upstream, like the herring, salmon, things like that. And when they're in spawning season, they would go really fast up the river, and some of them would go through the mouth of this basket, and out, as you can see at the bottom. It's not really locked, it's not really closed, and the fish would go in the front, out the back, and it would slow them down in order for you to catch some of them, because you have to live in balance. You can't harvest all of something, or you make the ecosystem imbalanced. And so our ancestors knew that lesson, the importance of balance and never taking all of something or the last thing or the first of something, to let it actually go through a process properly and in balance. And of course, there's cooking, thinking about clam bakes today that we think of as a modern American thing, but it really comes from our ancestors and the idea of the harvest in the summer months. All of our summer Thanksgiving, they're called something else, can come with the clam bake. Our green bean Thanksgiving and our green corn harvest, that's the early harvest of the corn, all come with the idea of the ocean harvest and the fish and the clams and the lobsters and the foods from the ocean. One of the things that's also important is the care of these things, whether that's the smoking and drying of the fish for later. Today, people are used to having smoked salmon and understand what that tastes like, but that is something that is very much part of the work that we do in our communities and continue. Wampum comes from the ocean, from the quahog shell. In that picture, you see the white beads that are on top. Those are actually where the word wampum comes from, because it comes from the word wampum piog, which means white. And historically, that got changed and misunderstood. And today, most people see the purple parts of the shell as being wampum. But really, wampum was to record history. It was gives plans for trade, commemorate treaties, institution, for condolence, for spiritual purposes, summon the council, honor others, to name just two. It was never codified until university here. And of course, there's ceremony of cleansing. We have annual ceremonies that are connected to the ocean, that is about renewal and rebirth. Sweat Lodge is connected to water, and often in that space by water. And then, of course, the traditional herbs. There's music connected to the water drum. Now, we didn't necessarily put in the drum, but the idea of water is important in the connection. But those cleansing ceremonies were always done by the ocean. But we have to understand also that the ocean was used for conquest. Conquest is the strategy of wanting to go someplace for the greed of the resources, using your power, your military, economic, weaponry, political, etc. forms of power, using your entitlement to be able to go based on the word of someone else, the doctrine of discovery, for example, and that gives you someplace, stick a flag, and believe that you have to do that, and take things that don't belong to you and people of their place. Also, conquest is about promoting fear and hate. It's about censoring people, silencing them. And then when all of those things don't work, to forcibly eradicate them through violence and genocide, it's forced assimilation. And so the ocean, unfortunately, was for conquest. It was used for enslavement. The transatlantic trade came to be in the 1400s, starting with Columbus and Columbus's family, and following the papal bulls and the doctrine of discovery. And so, even though the ocean gives us so much, it also, in some ways, through use of it as a tool of navigation, to go and trade with people, for exploring for people, but most importantly, for the resources and the economy of it, has been to the detriment of many indigenous peoples, not just here, but across the globe. There was changes, and we know there's still changes. Industrial whaling was changes. I can remember going to the Mystic Seaport Museum and them talking about whaling, and how shocked I was that they literally would stay out on these whaling ships until their quota was met, but they would pull up the whales on the side of the ship, spin them around, take all the baleen off. Nope, said that wrong. They took the baleen too, but the blubber off the whales and then tossed the rest back into the ocean. When you think about that, that was so different and foreign, a completely different ideological way of thinking compared to indigenous ways of knowing, where you would use the whole entire gift. So you would hunt with teams of people. There was ceremony before, there were ceremonial paddling songs during, and there was ceremony after, giving thanks for that great whale that gave its life so that thousands of people may eat and survive. And so that's just a different way of being and the way of thinking about that. And so conquest changed the land. It changed the way that we interact with the plants and animals of this land, but also the land itself. And we've become, a very extractive economy. I won't go into that direction at this moment because I'll get sidetracked. But, it's really important for us to understand that conquest changed ideological worldviews and perspectives, beliefs, and value systems, or attempted to do so, for indigenous peoples. But we tried to reconcile that past and continue forward in a good way. So, social justice, right? We have lots of social justice movements. That happens to be myself, my daughter, and one of my daughter-in-laws. And there's so much extractive work that's going on that impacts indigenous people and indigenous women, whether that's missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, plus two-spirits. The extractive economies across the globe often impact women and children very greatly. And so it's really important for us to think about the impact of these things and our dispossession of access to the ocean in relationship to this. And social justice and the work that we're doing today is really about unpacking the historical trauma that has taken place over the last 400 years for indigenous people, and how it's dispossessed us, in this case specifically, to access to the ocean and waters. So just a couple of local issues that have happened. There are a couple of tribal members in the front of that picture. There's the Burrowville Power Plant, the LNG terminals, all the Burrowville Power Plant wanting to take the waters from our tribal lands. And you might say, what does this have to do with the ocean? And I just remind everybody that all waters, the waters under the ground, the waters in the ponds, rivers, lakes, streams, etc., all eventually pour out into the ocean, as you know. And so you can't talk about the waters singularly, you have to talk about them holistically. So if there's an algae bloom in the top of the bay or in a pond in what is now known as Roger Williams Park, coming from Mashapog Pond or anywhere else, we were just hearing on the news there's some place in South Kingstown that has some algae blooms going. That is impacting the ocean. It's impacting the fresh water, which then goes to the salt waters and is affecting that. Whether that's the toxins in the fish, the PCPs, the lead, the mercury, all of those things are impacting our people. Why? Because even though we may not be fully subsistence living today, we like to say we're subsistence supporting our diets. We're connected to our cultural knowledge, and that requires that we're doing this kind of harvesting. So we partnered with Brown, URI, the Narragansett Indian tribe, Tomaquag Museum was a sub-partner, and we did the Namas Fish Project. It's a little redundant because Namas means fish in our language, but nonetheless, and it was to study the fish in the waters on our reservation, but also the relationship of fish in our community and fishing, and the impacts of that. And so unfortunately, you know, a lot of people that, no matter whether you're indigenous to this place or indigenous to someplace else and then immigrate here, they were finding that immigrants were eating the fish in Mashapog Pond, for example, that is toxically polluted. And then also indigenous people were eating the fish in those ponds because it's a modern day contemporary thing, the idea of catch and release fishing. Indigenous people think if you're going to catch it, you need to eat it. And matter of fact, we're taught that as young people. That's how you learn to, you know, skin a fish, because you have to do the whole thing. And so these are issues around poor air quality, poor water quality, and also issues of sovereignty in relationship to Narragansett Bay and the ocean, and the importance for our people. So there's lots of initiatives that are going on. This one happened to be connected to No DAPL, No Dakota Access Pipeline, Water is Life, Nippon Kitiawank. Water is Life, that happens to be me and one of my nieces. We were doing a ceremony there in honor of that. I went down to DC and was in the big protests down there. This newspaper clipping is in regards to two of my nephews and one of my sons who went out and stayed at Standing Rock as water protectors and actually came back, and one of my nephews came back and brought his two cousins, and they built this longhouse for the kids in the school that was going to be there. So it's this idea of community and this nationwide and worldwide initiatives around protecting the water and protecting the sacred and ensuring our access. And so there's lots of reclamation projects. I don't necessarily have time to talk about all of them, but I wanted to think about what Indigenous communities are doing for reclamation. Different communities are working on renewable energies. Even in our planning for our new museum, we're thinking about in planning solar power, water capture, indigenizing the landscape, doing passive house standards, things like that, to ensure that we could do the best that we could possibly do and still be affordable. But there's also a lot of work around food sovereignty. The museum does a lot of work around food sovereignty, food systems, partnering with other agencies for food recovery and distribution to Indigenous people, who are the most impoverished people in the state of Rhode Island, and frankly, the most impoverished people in this country, despite being the first peoples of this place. There's a lot of work around heritage seed gathering and various forms of green economies. In the picture above, we're talking about clam gardens down at Mashpee. They have, you know, saltwater fisheries and working on different kinds of sustainability and projects. There is cultural and ecotourism that's connected to Native communities as well as other communities. My brother and sister-in-law run Ashawag Farm, which is connected to that as well, and they founded the Narragansett Food Sovereignty Initiative. And this was a picture of one of the flyers when they had a international intertribal food sovereignty event, and people came from across Indian country to participate here in Rhode Island in 2018. One of our biggest issues is access. Not just access to the salt ponds, which I referenced, but that's also an issue. Tomaquag Museum staff and the Narragansett tribal environmental officer, a year or two ago, we went and met with DEM because we keep getting blocked for access to the salt ponds. And so we keep fighting for our rights to have access to the salt ponds. A couple of years ago, maybe last year, I don't know, quite a few tribal members, including a couple who work at the museum, were down in Narragansett testifying to have access to go on the beach with tribal ID to make sure we can have access. So we're always working for our rights to have access to the salt waters, and access for ceremony, access for fishing, access in every way necessary. There's been many broken treaties and certainly lots of legal manipulations that have stripped us of access and rights to those places. There's a lot of land back initiatives, and those initiatives are slow but going. And one of the things that sticks out to me is the Indigenous Land Trust that's out in Mashpee area in Massachusetts, but it is an intertribal land trust. So it's this idea of land back and access to these resources. And as I mentioned to you before, going to the ocean, the importance of ceremony. I'm not showing ceremony, but that picture was from a day when we were doing ceremony. And so it's that idea of that access and importance of access to those resources. What else is important is continuation of traditional ecological knowledge. This is from a couple of years ago. We still are doing summer camps, but these pictures are from a couple of years ago where young people were being the counselors to even younger kids in the Native community. Robin taught the kids how to make nets, and they actually went out in the waters and caught crabs. And they were quite impressed with themselves in doing so in a way that was the way that their ancestors would have done so. And so that continuation is important, that access is important so that kids and families can know how to harvest the plants, the roots, the tubers, harvest the salt waters, the saltwater fish and shellfish and plants. It's really important for us to have that continuation. And this is a picture of Sherry Pocknet with one of her big fish, and it's a way through her being a James Beard award-winning chef, but it's through this indigenous foods and indigenous foodways that she's sharing that cultural knowledge. And in the bottom picture, I'm showing another community gathering where people were cooking the fish. This is commonplace in our community to have fish cooked this way out on an open fire and to do that. And so it's important for us to continue and pass down those traditional knowledges so people can have access to that. And so here's a picture of some of our relatives from across this latitude. People are from Aquinnah, from Mashpee, from Narragansett, from Shinnecock, Montauk, and Mohegan and Mashantucket. And so this being water protectors, but also this continuation of knowledge, because they all participated in making this dugout canoe. And it's very important for us to continue the knowledge of making the dugout canoe, paddling the dugout canoes, moving that cultural knowledge forward. And they took this dugout canoe from the Connecticut shoreline over to Long Island, so across the Sound, as our ancestors once did regularly. And so giving thanks to Kíttan, the ocean, but also the connection to all waters because water is life. This is a quote by a Dene Tohoda Odom activist, and it's water is not only a human and indigenous right, it is a sacred and powerful being. Our delegation is concerned that water is quickly becoming the next great commodity. But amidst the rampant corporate buy-up of water resources, there is a growing movement for the protection of water as a basic human right. The art in this beautiful image is by Silver Moon LaRose, who is Narragansett and our assistant director at the museum. So I'm going to stop my screen here. I know I went a little fast, but we wanted to make sure that there was plenty of time for Q&A today. And so I hope I gave you enough. And if not, hopefully the things that you asked me will give me more things to say. Thank you, Katabatash.
Thank you very much, Lorén. And I want to start with this question. So, I didn't do land acknowledgement. Since you're here, this is your land. And then I thought, like, I'm just only being here 8 months. And I appreciate, well, to the truth that by knowing the history of conquest and the continuous, the pain that the people are causing, I started appreciating how important it is for us to say and continuously saying that this is not my land, this is your land. And I think it's really important. But yet, there is a blog about land acknowledgement in the Tomaquag Museum. Everybody should read it. And in a way that it is also can be a very performative. Last month, we talked about positionality, where it's situated. It's similar sort of thing. We perform that we care, but yet we don't really understand.
Yeah, Silver Moon has been leading. I've done them too, but I'm so busy with the new museum. I'm doing it a little bit less right now. But Silver Moon is doing professional developments that help people go through the process of creating land acknowledgement. Because a lot of people will call us up and they're like, what should our land acknowledgement say? It's not that simple. You really do have to, and I appreciate what you said of having to understand the history and the people who are here. And when you understand that better, then your land acknowledgement is more meaningful, but it's also not just the words, it's what are you going to do? When we were working with the University of Rhode Island, and when I say that, I was on the Native American Advisory. I am on the Native American Advisory at URI. But also they were working directly with the Narragansett tribe, which is the right protocol to do. And when they do that, but it's not just enough to create a document that says the words, it's what are you going to do next? As a land grant institution that knows that their lands were stolen from our people, working toward the tuition waivers for Narragansett students was it was a really long time, and we worked for years to get that to happen. But that's an example of doing something, doing something. The other thing is they invite Native students and Native community members to come and do the colloquium land acknowledgements on each of the sessions. That's another example of doing something. Do know that when you invite someone to come and do a land acknowledgement, it's not them reading your institution's land acknowledgement. It's them expressing their sense of identity and belonging to this place because they're welcoming you to this place. It's not the same thing. So in the blog post, I speak about that quite a bit. So you can check that out on the blog as well. It's a while ago because I got requested to do that so much early on that we made this blog post quite a while ago.
And in some ways, I mean, it might be a little bit contradict, but sometimes I feel like it's kind of like easy if I come to you and then ask you, hey, Lorén, can you train me or can you create a land acknowledgement for Ocean Nexus? It's almost as if like I'm coming to you and then ask you, so I got things properly done. And I feel that's not the way, that shouldn't be that way. I should actually do my own thing and then come in and ask you, this is what we worked, we thought about it, and then we thought what it is, and this is the best we came up with, and only 8 months in Rhode Island. What do you think, Lorraine?
Yeah.
I
Well, you can do
yeah,
that, or you can have someone like someone from our education team, like Silver
right.
Moon, lead you through the process. And the difference, I would say,
Hmm.
is that you get a first person perspective on the history that even if you were just reading this thing and that thing, you might not be able to get. So that's an option anyway for people out there, virtually and or in person, because we've done them in multitudes of ways
Yeah,
for
I think it's
people
really,
across the region.
yeah, thank you. It's really important for me to just, and I'm sorry, everyone, I'm just talking myself, but for me to kind of like distinguish between working and then asking and for the help and training. You know, I don't like training. This is not, if you know what I mean. Some trainings are really good. You're trained to learn something. That's wonderful. But if you can go through certain things, especially for the things on the social justice, like training or day training,
Mhm.
I think it's just superficial and it's almost patronizing. So, I have a very different opinion, but I think there's a way that we could somehow learn, and we could learn how to learn. I think that's really important. And but one thing I wanted to ask you, there's about like a couple of things I wanted to ask you, but the one thing I wanted to ask you, there has been so like a discussion out there for the small scale fisheries. How to protect small scale fisheries, how to protect communities, which is extremely relevant and important. But main thing they usually come up with one of those is rights and access. And for some reason, again, being myself, the it's just really always quite manipulative when we actually use those words. But from your experience, perhaps those are very useful words, very useful terms to approach. Would you share with us, what could potentially be manipulative risk that we need to watch out, and what is the usefulness of using those terms?
Well, I guess I can only say it from my vantage point. We use those terms because we think as Indigenous people, as the first people of this land, we should have rights
Yes.
to access the ocean. The history repeatedly dispossessed us of access to these spaces. Why? Because they're multi-million-dollar homes now, right, on these spaces and places. And so I feel that we continue to assert our rights to these right of ways and to places that we've always gone. I can remember, I'm going to be 59 in September. And I remember when my husband and I were first married, I guess, when back in my early 20s, and we were out in one of the salt ponds in Charlestown, we were crabbing. And we were there for maybe an hour. We had a few crabs, not a ton, but a few. And this guy came zooming over in his motorboat and he just started yelling at us about taking his crabs. And that was the thing that was the trigger for me. Most people
Mm.
know I'm pretty mild-mannered, but there are some triggers. And that was one of them. So I just gave him a whole history lesson on that boat. I like told him this is our land. We're indigenous to this place. You're a tourist. You're coming in just for the summer and trying to act like you own this land and own all these crabs. And I just gave him a piece of my mind. My husband was going like this, right? But you know, he was embarrassed so much so that he sent his son back with a frozen piece of bluefish as an offering, right, to apologize. But it's
That's
that
not bad.
it's that sense of entitlement, right?
Mm,
So
mm,
they felt entitled that this place was theirs and that everything there is theirs. And so I would say that no, we have rights and we have access and we should have access to spaces and places. Um, in regards to like the small fisheries, I think, it's a complex issue, right?
mm, mm.
There's the complexity of the big time corporate greed taking every fish and everything out of the water and wasting half of it. And then there's the small fishery that is just trying to make a living, trying to do the right things, trying to be in balance. So, you know, I have relatives who are fishermen, and I think, and my daughter did a lot of oral histories when she was in college, a few years back, with different people, different communities of people that were fishing. And I think it's important for the average person to have access to these waterways. It shouldn't all be commodified in a way that no one has access and no one can go clamming or crabbing or, fishing for a variety of fish. And it shouldn't just be if you have the wealth to own oceanfront property. There should be access, for everybody who lives here, on these lands today. And, it tends to be indigenous and black and brown people and people of poverty that are dispossessed from these places. Some people can say it's all economic, but there's a intertwining of the poor economics with race and gender. So I think that you can't really take them apart. They're a little interwoven into each other. But the point is that people that are impoverished, and when I say that, you don't have to be actually poverty stricken to the extreme, but are anywhere from extreme poverty to working class to lower middle class, that are often dispossessed from access. And, I think Save the Bay is trying to make that space over there that's on the bay a little bit more accessible. But do the people that you're saying that you want it to be accessible know that it's accessible? And is it truly accessible? Because it's kind of hidden. It's, sort of behind the college, down in, and, the intent is good, but is the practice actually getting there for people from urban environments to actually have access to those things? And it tends to be that the really good access is for people that have a certain amount of wealth, and then it's right in walking distance to what they're doing. So someone decided to come to the door where I am and was trying to come in. So yeah, so that's an issue there.
But in sometimes because it's your rights and it's your access, of course you should have it. But then again, using those words typically kind of like brings in next, it's kind of like conditions and categories. Like, okay, you can have access if you're sustainable. You can have a rights if you're from, recognized. And in those categories and in those values, which are not inherently, not coming from the people from the place, but it's almost imposed. And sometimes it was really interesting that you said this idea of catching a fish and a release, right? That might be very conservation wise. But then again, I'm also catching a fish and eat type. And then that doesn't really run well. So when you actually meet the people who's got really right-minded, it's really wanting to work with you, but yet idea is much more on kind of preservation of the nature or protecting nature in a very Western way. What is
100%.
your how do you kind of like communicate your cultural values?
So that comes up a lot in land trusts. So I do a lot of traditional ecological, or our team does, but I'm going to speak to my own experience. Traditional ecological knowledge walks in land trusts around the region. And I've actually done it even virtually for the land trusts in Boston and for the National Land Trust Association, but I always push on that issue around conservation. So land trusts ideas around conservation is we make it look beautiful, we conserve it, and people can walk through the paths and they can observe it, but there's no relationship there. And so I always push them that there should be relationship to the plants and there should be harvest. If you want plants and animals to flourish, there's a balance that happens, right? And so if we decided today we were never going to harvest X, then it's going to either get overgrown to the point that it kills itself, or
Mm,
or it's going to make other animals and plants out of balance. And so that's something we keep talking about. Like, people should have access to harvest.
mm, mm,
Historically, we harvested, okay, let's say a poplar. You
mm,
harvest the poplar to make a dugout canoe. Well, then you use
mm,
the bark of that dugout canoe for the covering for your home, or for the quiver for your arrows, or the inner bark for medicine. You see where I'm going with that? And
I do.
so there's this holistic use of
Mm,
the gift of the land. And
mm,
but then that means that you're also taking one away so something else can grow up, because
mm.
you have to have that balance. And I think that's the thing that an indigenous ways of knowing is always around the balance, right? No, we shouldn't go into the land trust and remove, everything because we want to harvest bark. No, but we should have ways and mechanisms in which people who are indigenous to a place, or even people who are new to a place but have these life ways, could have access to that. It's very much we're conserving and preserving, and we're just going to look at it kind of mindset. And I don't agree with that mindset, because I think that if you live in balance, there's a way to utilize these resources in a good way.
And the other thing, this is a funny thing. When I started my education and back in England, and I did anthropology, and it was one of the first topic was this nature and culture. They teach, we think nature and culture are separate, but there's different cultures out there which has nature and culture together. And then just sitting down as a Japanese student thinking, well, yeah, no, I do. But what do you mean nature, culture? So I couldn't really understand their logic to it. Surely that you come across with in your teaching of the traditional ecological knowledge, in your teaching of your relationship on the land and in oceans, this divide or dichotomy is very hard to pass. Is there any way that you can carry this message?
So I do. And my example of that is, there are people that come from a different viewpoint that really struggle to understand that our culture is completely interwoven with the environment. You
Mm,
cannot be indigenous and not be directly engaged and have a relationship with the environment, in
mm,
the sense that it's intrinsic in who we are. It's connected to our whole identity. This
mm,
place is connected to our identity. And
mm,
so I think that, as indigenous people, our languages come from this place, our stories come from this place, our life ways come from this place, our foods come from this place, the tools we make, every single thing about our culture is steeped in this place. And so for me, it's a common sense thing, but I get what you're saying. Other people come from a different viewpoint and perspective, and they don't get that. So when I opened Nuituan School at Tomaquag Museum in 2003, we didn't articulate environmental studies in the curriculum. And they were like, well, you have to have some, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, what? You can't teach about indigenous culture without talking about the environment. Like, you can't talk about our homes, you can't talk about our foods, you can't talk about our lifeways without talking about the environment. It's all so woven together. And so that's something that is always there. And I know I was teaching a professional development for scientists. This is going back a few years ago now.
mm,
I remember this is a whole long talk, so I'm going to try to say it in, 1 minute, but I was trying to get them to understand traditional ecological knowledge and our world view, and the intersectionality of what today they call science, and
mm,
how that's intersected with not just scientific knowledge in our life ways, but also philosophy and
mm,
art and
mm,
music. And like, these things are not separate. Like, to us, science is interwoven into all of those things and
mm,
beyond. And
mm,
so I remember I frustrated, I mean, these were grown adult professional like people that were working in universities. And this one gentleman literally put up his hoodie and put it over his head because I like blew his mind in a way that he couldn't understand. He was so frustrated by the conversation. And mind you, I'm telling you 30 seconds of it versus the hour that I was talking about it. And what I said to him, because we were talking about it, these professionals were going to be working with Indigenous youth. And so we were trying to get them to understand an Indigenous way of knowing the world. And, this is before, Robin Wall Kimmerer's book came out and people got a glimmer into what people were trying to express. This was probably 15 years ago. And he was so frustrated, but I said to him, now look at how you feel and think about how the Indigenous student feels in your class. Because you're saying what we're saying is a complete 360 of what you know. Well, that's also true for the Indigenous person in the way they understand science, right? And so it is a challenge. It's because we all come from different worldviews. And the only thing we can do is be open-minded. And like I said to the group there, I'm not trying to change your worldview. I'm just trying to let you see a peek into someone else's worldview so that maybe if they ask you a question about the intersectionality of these other things in science, that you wouldn't automatically shoot them down and say, no, that's not science, right? And so those are the kinds of things that we're trying to get across and trying to get people to broaden their perspectives. And it's more about understanding than necessarily them changing the way they're teaching or the way that they understand that particular science, but the idea that someone else might come from a worldview that is completely different.
Yeah, and then it's a nice peak. Come to this side, it's really great, it's not hurtful or hate or anything. It's really good. Just cross and then come to this side, put the hood up. But
Well,
Lord,
I always try to
thank
say
you.
that it's not a competition, but because I think that,
Yeah,
we all come from our spaces. There looks like there's a question from
yeah,
Jose.
I know that Jose is from
Chile.
Chile.
I'm
Would you
from
mind answering
south
that?
of Chile, north of Patagonia, and I want to ask about food dimensions. How did the problematization about food in communities to put in a matter concern, for instance, as a political dimension? Could you talk about the motivations? So, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, but I'm going to give it a try. What I'm thinking is like the reason that we put terms like food sovereignty out there, which can sound political, I think it's really about reclaiming the rights to access to traditional foods, traditional food ways, and traditional harvesting of foods. And those systems and structures of conquest and colonization that tried to block them. Like here in Rhode Island, there was, for example, there was a law on the books that we couldn't harvest bark. And if you take, as I just mentioned before, if you say we can't harvest bark, that means we can't harvest certain food sources. We can't harvest certain materials that can make things, whether that's baskets or coverings for your home. It takes away medicines, things like that. So I think that, that's a surface answer to a very complex question. But I think that the politicization of it is more around getting a national and maybe international movement for Indigenous people and rights on the foods because, they've commodified foods in a way that most people, especially here in America, we're eating like a very limited set of foods over and over and over again, which are not healthy for Indigenous people. I can't speak for all Americans, but those foods are not good for our makeup. And that's why there's diabetes. That's why there's heart disease. That's why there's obesity. There's so many factors that are interwoven in that, but those are the commodification of foods that are shoved at populations. And if you're wealthy enough, you can avoid some of those things. But if you're not wealthy, you're impoverished, but you're not only impoverished financially, but you're impoverished by the lack of nutrients that your body gets from the diversity of the foods. And so
Mm.
I think that, you know, these things are really problematic. And when we had this amazing opportunity, we were in a partnership with an institution in Boston,
Mm.
Tufts, and they had a bunch of indigenous women, 4 or 5, that came from Brazil. And they were from different indigenous communities across Brazil. And they were here, and we got invited as local indigenous people to participate. You can read about it in our rematriation blog.
I did, yeah.
But what made me think of it is because you were talking about those food dimensions and food dimensionalities. And there was one woman that came, and the food here was problematic. And the big institution was not paying attention because she
Mm.
was not eating. The foods that they were putting on the table were very modern day processed foods. They were not whole foods. So when she came, and they all did, to our museum, we gave them, you know, pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds and nuts and berries and like whole foods, meaning it's literally what it was. It hasn't been
Mm.
turned into something else.
Mm. Mm.
And you know, when you get to indigenous spaces that are really remote, they're still eating like that. Um,
Mm.
my brother-in-law, he went down to South America and stayed with indigenous communities, and they actually had to help him because he was almost starving. Uh,
Mm.
even being indigenous from here and used to eating off the land to a certain point,
Mm.
his body was burning the food that they were giving him so fast
Mm. Mm.
that they had to actually give him more food
I
um,
see.
than they were taking in.
I see.
Because your body actually metabolizes differently now because of
Right.
the food that we're being.
Because of the processed food and all the amounts and all. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's also why a lot of people have food allergies, including myself today. You know, if you think about it, we've only been eating some of these foods for like 100, 150 years. And it's
Right.
really been the biggest population shift of these foods was from like 1950 forward.
Right. Right.
And so most people were still not eating a lot of those sort of quote unquote mainstream American foods. I remember my grandfather talking about having a sandwich with an oyster, and he took it to school. And so he was ashamed of having this oyster in his like sandwich, that his mother had made biscuits and put this big oyster that was like this back in the day
Wow.
um, on the biscuit. And so he went and ate in the thing. But when he was older, he was telling the story like what he wouldn't do to be able to eat that oyster sandwich that his mother had made for him today. You know, the oysters aren't even close to that big.
Right.
Even
Right.
the biggest of the biggest, you'd probably have to put 2 or 3, you know? So it's just food has changed so dramatically, and it's because food has become a commodity. It's
Mm.
just like the land and the waters have become
Mm.
commodities, and in different places in the world, humans are still commodities. And this is the problem of our human society, is that we've commodified all of these things instead of using and taking what you need. One of my pet peeves these days is I don't like to go to buffets. You know, as a rule, I don't choose to go to a buffet. And why?
Mm.
Couple of reasons. One, because it's a lot of wasted food. I mean, like
Yeah.
just so much waste. In order for us as, you know, entitled Americans to have whatever food at our whim, we're putting all this food on this buffet, and it's wasteful. Um, but it's also I guess that's the number one reason. It's absolutely wasteful to the things, but it's also just not healthy.
Mm.
So there's a lot of chemicals that are put on there to preserve them, and there's just so many things that happen. And so I think that foods and food systems and the commodification of food and the commodification of the waste of food is just not okay. The way that we waste food here. And there's going to come a day that there's not going to be enough resources, and it's
Mm.
partly
Mm.
because we're just wasting resources. And when you commodify them, like when they were commodifying the whale, they were killing off way
Right.
more whales than were necessary. The same with
Right.
the seals, same with the beavers. You know, and that's why we're out of balance. You
Yeah,
know,
that's no. that's not rich, is it? It's not, you know, having so much is not rich. Having something good with the love is good, you know, and it's just we tend to forget that,
Yes.
and then that's the difficulty. But Lorén, thank you so much. You know,
You're welcome.
so
Good to be
much,
on.
so much we learn, and so much I talk to you, and you know, this is just absolutely delight. And you know, I'm sorry, everyone, we live close. So Lorén, let's have a dinner sometime. I'm gonna cook.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, as well, to participate.
Thank
You
you.
know, this has been a delight, and Lorén and I, and with the Notion Access Tomaquag, will hopefully to make some collaborations, and we're gonna work together. And thanks for you know, she's in Europe now, but Dr. Amelia Moore, who's been, you know, who made these things happen. And thank you very much, everyone. Lorén, thanks a lot. See you soon.
Thank you. See
Right.
you soon.
See
Take
you.
care, everyone.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks.
Be well.
You too. Bye.